Hello, welcome to Notes on History. I'm Paul Stetzel. Today, I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite rules of history. Now, please understand, whenever I talk about rules of history, and I'll bring them up from time to time, I'm not saying that history follows a set of prescribed laws or formulas like physics or daytime television. When I say rules of history, what I'm really talking about is a set of maxims that I've considered over the years as a simple means of understanding what happened in the past. If you think back to your high school or college days, or even if you're in school right now, were you ever confused by the way people acted in the past? You should have been at some point. People were nuts back then, okay? Not at all like today.
I'm asking you right now, do you still stand by your pledge made in 2008 to provide a pony for every American?
Yes, I do, sir. Free ponies for all Americans, one of the overlooked issues in America today.
Well, one of the problems that poses for us today is that when we don't understand why someone did something, we tend to discount them. And that really doesn't help us understand why things happened. And we need to understand why things happened, because that's how we got to this whole mess. So that brings me to rule number one. If you take anything away from my videos, understand rule number one. It seemed like a good idea at the time. Before you dismiss people in the past, thinking that they were just ignorant and backwards, or whatever term you want to use, understand that nobody, no historical figure who ever changed the world, ever did so in the hopes that their actions would have absolutely terrible outcomes. There's always a reason. Now, the beauty of hindsight is that we can sometimes determine if it was a good reason or a bad reason, if someone made a good decision or a foolish one. But people in the moment always made the decision that they thought was best based on what they thought was true. To illustrate this, I'm going to use an example from Roman history. I love using Roman history examples. No one ever complains that I'm being political when I use Roman history. I've never heard someone say, "Oh, you like Pompey Magnus? You're just trying to make America Magnus again." No one ever complains that I'm making a statement about gender dysphoria when I bring up Elagabalus. I'm going to use as an example the use of something called donatives. A big complaint that Marxists have had over the years is that poor men fight in rich men's wars. Well, that wasn't really how it worked during the Roman Republic, especially in the early years. Typically speaking, the more property you owned, the more likely you would find yourself fighting in the army, especially early on in Rome's history. The reason for this was very simple. The Roman state originally did not pay for the equipment and supplies used by the soldiers. At some point in the future, there'll be a section on the website devoted specifically to Roman history, and I'll cover taxation and economics in the ancient world. But for now, just understand that if you were a soldier in the Roman army prior to the Second Punic War, you probably paid for your own equipment. The legions would be raised as needed, meaning that a call would go out for everyone who was eligible to serve, and you had to show up if you were called. And you showed up for a campaign season with your own gear, served for the season, and you'd be home in time to harvest your crops. Rinse and repeat. There were several problems with this, and I should note that it took the Romans a very long time to realize that there were problems, because it wasn't like there was a professional army that they could look to as an example somewhere else in the Mediterranean. Not only were the soldiers responsible for showing up with their own equipment, which may or may not have been well taken care of, but you ended up with a lot of inexperienced troops. You also ended up with a lot of politicians leading the troops, which did not turn out well on a number of occasions. If you read Livy, Plutarch, any number of other different ancient historians, you might be shocked at how often the Romans lost, and I mean lost badly. The Romans were always at war. And by always, I mean that from its founding in the mid-8th century BC until the fall of the Republic in the 1st century BC, Rome was at peace for only a handful of years. They weren't at war all these years because they loved war, contrary to popular opinion. They were at war so much because they couldn't get it right. They couldn't win outright, and very, very often they would have to wear down their enemy over many, many years. Staying power might be a path to victory, But a war of attrition isn't really what anyone really wants. So they had to figure this out very, very painfully, and eventually they worked towards creating a professional army. The legions we picture in our heads when we think of Roman soldiers, that's the army I'm talking about. A professional army sounds great, and indeed the change is made for an astonishingly effective fighting force. It was the only really professional army in a world full of nothing but citizen militias and tribal war bands and mobs with pitchforks. It turned out very well for the Romans, who were not able to just fight well on the battlefield, but they were able to field well what they needed for battle. Organization and logistics skills that came along with the professionalism was what's really astonishing. But all this meant that these soldiers were now not going to go home to take care of their fields. They weren't going to go home to find some other form of gainful employment throughout much of the year, so the state had to pay them. This transition to paying a professional army happened not long before the transition from republic to empire, through a process involving civil strife, followed by civil war, followed by more civil strife, followed by more civil war, to be followed by dinner and drinks. The men who fought and won these conflicts commanded the loyalty of the legions, whom they paid handsomely, whose loyalty was to particular commanders rather than to the state. What's really shocking is that it took the Romans about 200 years to figure out that this might be a problem. All the men we call emperors, and a bunch more who just wanted the job, paid something called a donative. This was a payment made to the soldiers upon the emperor's ascension to the imperium, and sometimes additional smaller donatives were paid. This was in addition to their usual pay. Over time, these donatives became larger and larger, especially when the emperor had to rely on the legions to support his claim, like in 68 AD when 4 men claimed the right to succeed the Emperor Nero. The fact that powerful politicians and generals were willing to pay huge sums of money for the legion's support, well, it kind of gave the troops the idea that maybe their opinion mattered. It didn't help much when the Emperor Caligula's own troops killed him and installed a new emperor themselves. If people didn't realize that this was a dangerous situation, it became crystal clear following the death of an emperor named Pertinax. If you've ever seen the movie Gladiator, you've heard of the name Commodus. And while Commodus was not exactly the man portrayed in the movie, he was a jerk. And Pertinax was the emperor who tried to clean up the mess. This meant trying to put a stop to the corruption and the extravagance, and there were some extravagantly corrupt noses that got bent out of shape. The Praetorian Guard, who were the elite soldiers at Rome who acted as the emperor's bodyguard, they put up with Pertinax's anti-corruption crusade for almost a full 3 months before they killed him. Like I said, it wasn't the first time the Praetorian Guards had killed an emperor, but when they had shown Caligula the door, they put forward their own candidate. By this point, they had just become lazy. The story is told in Cassius Dio's history. It's also told by a Greek historian named Herodian. Also, Edward Gibbon gave a very good description of what happened in Volume 1 of his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. It's in Chapter 5, in case you're interested. The Praetorians announced from the walls of their fortress in Rome that they would auction off the empire to the highest bidder. This extremely undignified scene then played out, with Pertinax's father-in-law on the one side and this wealthy, sycophantic former consul on the other, each shouting offers back and forth over the walls until this former consul, a man named Didius Julianus, simply outbid his rival. He literally bought the Roman Empire. So yes, the Romans were able to effectively address several problems. They did this by creating professional soldiers serving in a standing army. Roman soldiers were from then on better trained, better led, better fed, and all around better at their jobs than anyone else around. But at no time did any Roman senator, consul, emperor, or ordinary citizen say, hey, you know what, guys? This is going to result in Scrooge McDuck buying Europe, but that's a price we're willing to pay. No one ever said that. But it still happened. That's it for today. If you like this video, please be sure to like Notes on History on Facebook, subscribe to this YouTube channel, or leave a comment below, or all three. If you didn't like it, Why are you still watching? Remember, I'm not just a historian, but I'm also a professional genealogist. If you visit notesonhistory.org, you can also find information on commissioning assistance for your family research project because, let's face it, what comes after the letter T and doesn't have time for research? I think we all know. Thanks for listening.